The post office artists were an elite corps, chosen by jury and paid directly by the Treasury. But most of the artists who got their money from the WPA might not have been able to make a living from art even in good times. That is a problem with the state paying salaries to artists. It isn't all going to be great. But some of it is very impressive.
The Native American theme by John Wally that's painted on the fire curtain in the auditorium, just spectacular.
How much art was being made which was actually commissioned by the WPA?
About 5,000 artists produced 108,000 easel paintings, a few thousand murals, 12,000 pieces of sculpture, and then prints and posters, probably numbering in the millions. At the time, many people felt this art wasn't worth a whole lot, and much of it was lost. My mom was cleaning out my grandmother's house a number of years ago in the 1980s, and she gave me some of the prints that my grandmother had. And I noticed on the back of one of them, it's now hanging in my house, that it says WPA, 10 cents. And I thought this is exactly what the WPA was doing in the 1930s. It was allowing people like my grandmother to buy a little print, frame it, and put it up in the house as a little sort of, homage to the period.
And it wasn't just visual art, it was theatre and music too.
At the height of Roosevelt's Federal Music Project, there were every month 3 million people going to listen to music. You don't have to have a very great proportion of that 3 million transformed by regular concert going to have made an enormous impact on the collective life of a nation. The Federal Music Project was asking for music for use. It asked composers to write music that was going to be meaningful, inspiring, and useful to large numbers of people. I don't think there's anything specifically patriotic about that. I think it was a political ideal, which maybe was too prescriptive, but certainly became extremely controversial within not much more than 10 years. So that, for instance, Copeland's Fanfare for the Common Man became a huge political hot potato because, God forbid, it mentioned the common man. The common man was off the agenda in the 50s, big time.
While they lasted, these projects were a training ground for many of the great artists of the 20th century. Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock, for instance.
You have an incredible group of American artists, Pollock and Guston and Stuart Davis and all sorts of artists. De Kooning was involved for a short while, but was forced out because he was an illegal alien. As in the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain countries, where the government paid artists to make work, the artists often painted very thinly in order to keep as much paint as they could so they could go home from their official painting and save some of that paint to make things that probably wouldn't have been acceptable to the WPA. But much of what the WPA produced is interesting in and of itself. Probably more than anything else, it's what kept artists alive.
Suddenly I realize I'm going 60 miles an hour. I don't remember the last 5 minutes. I can't seem to keep my mind to it.
Maybe it's your glasses. You never went for your new glasses.
No, I see everything.
Arthur Miller would always remind you, if you dared to suggest that he was a product purely of the Broadway commercial theatre, he would always remind you that he would not have got started without the WPA.
The same goes for Philip Guston, then a young radical, later famed as an abstract expressionist. He painted murals for this housing estate, which was then brand new. He also did the mural on the WPA building at the World's Fair of 1939.
You know, we're standing in a building built during the Depression. If you go all over New York City, one building after the next, we're still profiting from that. There were 200 pavilions in this park, and there was a very large pavilion celebrating the Works Progress Administration. And the very young Philip Guston, 26 years old, was hired by the federal government to do this mural on the front of the building. And I think it was just emblematic of what was happening in the WPA. You had somebody in the federal government decide to hire this kid named Philip Guston. And that's the kind of thing I hope we can get to back to that kind of imagination. This is not yet the mature Guston. This is the real WPA style, the kind of muscular worker wearing the suspenders, all those sort of celebrations of the working class.
The whole Roosevelt WPA area that seemed to be about championing nationalism across America, the worker. It had a touch of Stalinism about it, one way or another, all that art. But I suppose a number of artists could learn their trade, make mistakes, and actually, practice being artists.
And they could see public reaction, they could, interact with their peers. So, the WPA was an incredible boon for artists.
When your government is giving you money to make art, it makes you think about what your audience is. It meant a lot from what I understand from listening to my teachers. Philip Guston was one of my teachers. Artists often find nationalism rather tacky, creepy, corny, but that got redefined by thinking of the support having come from their country, and that means everybody in society.
Modern-day muralists here in Harlem commemorate that extraordinary time too. This church used to be the Lafayette Theatre, where 20-year-old Orson Welles made his name. He was chosen by producer John Houseman to direct a version of Macbeth for the Negro Theatre of Harlem.
There'd been absolutely nothing like it at all of any kind, but particularly when you think that it came out of a government-funded initiative. John Houseman smelt that this kid had something absolutely extraordinary and fearless about him. He also had a vast company of 100 actors. That was the great thing about the Federal Theatre Project. Totally out of work. In fact, many of them had never, ever stood on a stage at all. And were paid a pittance, of course, but there were 2 or 3 well-known black actors.
Arm it out! There is no flying hits or tearing here. I get to be weary of the sun, and with the estate of the world we're now undone. Ring the alarm bell!
I wanted to give the black actors a chance to play classics without it being funny, or even exotic. It's just, there it is. And I directed Macbeth without ever giving them a reading. And none of them had ever seen a Shakespearean play. And it was extraordinary, how good Shakespeare is, if it's spoken by somebody who's never heard somebody say it before.
Harlem was deeply, deeply suspicious. And so the first night was anticipated with this incredible, dangerous excitement. If it had gone the wrong way, I think there would have been riots and big, big, big trouble. But this it was an explosion, a celebration, a liberation of the play. The whole of Manhattan flocked to see it. It got immense coverage.
There were 5 blocks in which all traffic was stopped. You couldn't get near the theater in Harlem. When the play ended, there were so many curtain calls that finally they left the curtain open, and the audience came up on the stage to congratulate the actors. That was magical. My great success in my life was that play.
What Welles had done was to orchestrate it in a completely unique way. And of course, made Welles's young career.
But But the iconic artist of that era was Woody Guthrie.
This land is your land, and this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
He really was the chronicler of that era. No one captured it better than he did.
Nobody sent him out to cover it, so he could cover it. He could just write down what he saw and write down what he heard, and then he wrote it down for himself. You know, he wasn't on assignment. It wasn't like a newspaper editor reviewed what he wrote or anything like that. So it's very genuine. It's very pure and very genuine.
You ain't got the do-re-mi, folks. You ain't got the do-re-mi. Why, you better go back to beautiful Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Georgia, Tennessee.
Woody had always looked at the world from the bottom up, drifting across the states, identifying with the dispossessed. But many other writers discovered America for the first time by being paid to go out on assignment.
In the Writers' Project, you didn't have to be published. You didn't have to have aspirations to write fiction or poetry. They had a lot of people who were advertising copywriters who were out of work, who wrote government brochures who were out of work, who wrote leaflets who were out of work. Or you could just be somebody like Saul Bellow, who had never had a job.
So people like Bellow and John Cheever would have been on the dole.
Well, they were on the dole. This is one of the reasons that Bellow was always very open about having been on the WPA, whereas Cheever was ashamed of it, having been on welfare.
Do you think the New Deal put some of these artists in touch with their roots and with the wider America?
I think it did. I think it helped refocus their attention from Europe as the place where things were happening to America. It made them realize that they had a native ground that they could stand on and that was worth valuing. And without the encouragement to dig into the local soil, I think American art and American culture would have looked very different. Remember, in the 1920s and 1930s, if you were an American artist or an American writer, you had to go to Paris to practice your art and to be seen as serious. I mean, these are the people who transformed America from a cultural backwater into the capital of the 20th century.
The rain it quit and the wind got high and the black old dust storms filled the sky, and I swapped my farm for a Ford machine and I filled it full of this gasoline and started.
Woody Guthrie dug deep in that American soil, and after his death was acknowledged as a founding father of the American rock music that would rule the world. In his day, he was virtually a vagabond.
My mother used to tell me, you know, very funny stories about my dad, where he would go out to the corner store to get a pack of cigarettes and come home 2 weeks later. Wherever it took him, that's where it took him. When Woody would come over to eat, he would eat standing up. And people would say, sit down, you know, have a bite to eat. He'd come over for dinner. He says, I don't want to get too comfortable.
So Woody wasn't the obvious person to be a government employee.
Uncle Sam took the challenge in the year of 33 for the farmers and the workers and for all humanity.
Was he a supporter, do you think, of Roosevelt's New Deal?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, he campaigned for FDR quite a lot. He was on a thing called the FDR bandwagon with a group of artists that would go around and do these benefits and fundraisers and political campaign events. Woody was not, by the way, ever paid by any portion of that stuff, and, you know, except for going out to work for a month for the Bonneville Dam project, where he got $230.
Look down in the canyon and there you will see Grand Coulee showers her blessings on me.
And even then, as glad as he was to do it, he still felt somewhat encumbered. You know, anytime you work for someone, you have to give them what they want, kind of thing. And it kind of wasn't in his nature.
Woody was a communist supporter, and it was communism and the fear of communism that would be the death of the WPA.
Well, you won't find any subversive books here. Oh. Now, how about this fella? Now, this fella, Charles Dickens, wasn't he a communist?
The team who had made Black Macbeth, Orson Welles and John Houseman, found themselves at the center of that storm.